for it to catch up to the rich countries. Just to give you some sense then of not only the absolute gap, that is to say some countries are just absolutely poorer than other countries, we can also look at the relative gap. If you look here, if you index the rich countries at 100, in other words, your denominator, in 1960, middle-income countries accounted for 17% of GDP per capita. It equaled 17% of GDP per capita. But between 1960 and 1993, that 17% goes down to 11%. For poor countries, GDP per capita, they were better off, relatively speaking, in 1960. GDP per capita in poor countries was 3.4% in 1960. By 1993, it decreased to 2.1%. So the key point here, therefore, then, is that the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, the breakdown of embedded liberalism and Keynesian compromise, in some respects, may have been inevitable. That this is just how the global economy works. And that it was inevitable that American hegemony would be challenged, that private capital would overwhelm government. Or, one might argue, that what the breakdown of Bretton Woods did was that it exposed bad policy. That the global levels of inequality we see today were not inevitable. That they were, in fact, a function of poor government policy. Either way, the data shows us that the rich, as we see in this table, are becoming relatively richer, and the poor are becoming relatively poorer. So if you go back to this table, right, here's the absolute gap. There are quite simply very rich countries in an absolute sense, and there are quite simply extremely poor countries in an absolute sense. But over time, the rich are getting relatively richer, and the poor are getting relatively poorer. So that's the first vignette, the first story. Interpret it however way you will. The second story I want to talk about is the story of domestic redistribution. So the first story is about the global economy. Now we're going to look at national economy. And this curve here, which I guess could be anything, it looks like any other curve, but it's a famous curve in economics called the Kuznets curve, K-U-Z-N-E-T-S. Made famous by economist Simon Kuznets. And it's the inverted U curve. And basically the argument that Kuznets makes by looking at global economic history is that we should expect inequality to rise as countries go from being poor to richer. You can see here, as an economy becomes richer over time, we should see levels of inequality, or we should expect levels of inequality to rise. But that as these economies mature from being low income to middle income to high income countries, we expect, therefore, that this curve to come back down. So this is what economic orthodoxy teaches us. That as economies begin to grow, inequality inevitably rises, but as these economies mature, inequality inevitably decreases. Now, as political scientists, we don't like questions, or we don't like assertions of inevitability, right? We want to know why inequality decreases over time. And as political scientists, we want to understand how the politics allows for inequality to decline over time, so that we just simply do not accept this as a given. Well, part of the explanation, as you'll recall from our last lecture, is the emergence of the welfare state. As we can see here, and this is the table that we showed last time, we can see that over time, between the 1950s into the 1980s, we see a significant increase across these major rich countries. We see a major significant increase in welfare state spending. In things like health, unemployment insurance, old age, income security or pensions, social assistance and housing. This bundle of spending increases over time from the 1950s to the 1980s. Now, I want to also stress it's not just about spending. There's also a political logic of welfare state expansion. The theory of the welfare state is such that one of the reasons why we see increased social spending is because of what theorists call the logic of industrial capitalism. In many ways, it's a sort of quasi-Marxist argument that as capitalism and industry matures, that it's only natural as the working class begins to grow that societies begin to care more for those most vulnerable. That in the early stages of industrialism, these sorts of concerns and issues are not that major. But that as industrial capitalism matures over time, we just naturally see the expansion of the welfare state. A more precise argument that riffs on this notion of industrial capitalism is basically the unionization argument. Statistically speaking, when we look at social welfare spending over the last 100, 150 years, there is a very significant correlation, a very significant relationship between unionization rates and social welfare spending. Those societies in which union rates increase most rapidly are precisely those societies in which social spending increases. The political argument here is that as unions mobilize and become more powerful, then unions will collectively mobilize and engage in things like collective bargaining over wages and social protection. So there's a political argument here. Unions play a crucial role in the expansion of the welfare state. Related to this, then, is that we also see at the same time historically the rise of leftist political parties, or social democratic parties. And there's also a very significant correlation between the rise of social democratic parties and their electoral fortunes with unionization rates. So you can see the relationship forming here. As economies become more industrial, they then lead to greater unionization rates. And as unions begin to mobilize, we begin to see the rise of social democratic leftist parties. And there are, again, statistically very high correlations here in this relationship. As a part of this process, then, we begin to develop this notion of social citizenship. That societies over time begin to change their own conception of citizenship. And T.H. Marshall once referred to this as being social citizenship. That belonging to a nation not only meant political citizenship, that is the right to vote, for instance, but also social citizenship, in the sense that we all belong together in the same society, that this type of social welfare state is a signifier of a civilized, socially aware, and social citizenship type nation state. So again, when we look back at this table, we do see an increase in social spending over time, but what I want to stress to you is that there's a political explanation for this. And there's plenty of statistical data to support this very assertion. And if you think about it, it actually has worked. These are photos taken of work that we've been doing, some projects we're running in India, but when you look here, if you look at the Gini coefficient, the Gini coefficient is a statistical measure of income inequality. The closer you are to 0, the more equal your society is. The closer you are to 1, the more unequal your society is. If you look at it generally across the board, and I've just selected a few countries here, rich advanced industrial countries have tended to have lower Gini coefficients, which means that they are more egalitarian. Less developed countries tend to be less egalitarian and more unequal. So the argument goes that these advanced industrial countries experience industrial capitalism, experience the rise of unions, experience the rise of social democratic parties, experience the rise of social citizenship, and therefore then you see a much more egalitarian distribution of income. Just so that it doesn't seem like this is what we call political science selection bias and selecting on the dependent variable, if you look here at this table, which basically shows levels of inequality around the world, I should point out here this should be basically 0.25. Right, this is the Gini coefficient scale. You can see at this table that generally speaking, greater levels of inequality are in poorer countries, and greater levels of egalitarianism or income equality tend to occur in rich countries. Again, the argument being that advanced industrial countries have experienced the political economy and the political economic processes of the welfare state. Poorer countries, on the other hand, those that have not experienced the same industrialization, are ones that have not. Now, before you buy this argument, lock, stock, and barrel, of course, there is this famous table. So what is going on here? I've just suggested to you that advanced industrial countries are those economies that experienced industrialization, experienced the rise of unions, like the Auto Workers Union in the U.S. or the Teamsters and other things like that. And through the work of the unions and the Democratic Party in the United States, we should see welfare state expansion and so on, as we see here in Canada, beginning in the 1960s. And yet, this is happening. This year tracks levels of inequality in the United States beginning in the 1980s. And we can see, beginning in the 1990s, massive levels of inequality. But what's very interesting and what's important to point out here is that the poor are not getting poorer. This tail is not tailing off this way. They're staying relatively the same, if not growing. It's this 1% that is growing massively. Right? The top 1% is now at this level and is at a slope of that angle. So, when we think about growing levels of inequality in advanced industrial countries, as we know, when we think about the Occupy Wall Street, the 99% versus 1%, it's not so much that the poor are getting poorer, it's just that the super rich are becoming super richer. I think, that's what I want to say. But you get what I mean. Now, just so you get a sense that this is not only an industrial country problem, we think about it in the context of the other elephant in the room, the other big economy, which of course is China. In 2009, the top 10% of income earners in China earned 23 times more than the bottom 10%. Just so you get some sense as to what this actually means in context, in 1998, just 10 years before, the ratio between the top 10% and the bottom 10% was 7 times. So in a period of 10 years, the gap between the top and bottom 10% has gone from 7 times, a ratio of 7 to 1, to a ratio of 23 to 1. The Gini coefficient in 2009, according to official data in China, is 0.47, which would rank it among some of the most unequal societies in the world. And if you care, in fact, the Chinese government itself has stated that a Gini coefficient of 0.4 was already politically alarming. This Gini coefficient has far surpassed that 0.4. The period that China is in right now is very politically alarming for Chinese policymakers. But let's unpack this notion of inequality so we get a sense that the rich are 23 times richer than the very poor. But another way of slicing this data is to look at it in terms of urban versus rural. If any of you have ever been to China, most of you have probably spent time in urban centers, right, where it is quite wealthy. If you look at this table, actually, beginning in the 1980s when China's economy opens up, we actually see overall economic growth beginning in the 1980s. China as a nation grows 8.5% through the 1980s to 8.1% in the 1990s. So we see aggregate economic growth. But one of the interesting things is we see more rapid growth in the urban center, especially beginning in the 1990s. In the 1990s, urban economic growth is at 7.1% a year, and rural economic growth dips below 4% a year. What we begin to see beginning in the 1990s is a deliberate policy on the part of the Chinese government to promote export-oriented foreign investment, to basically promote what was called a coastal development strategy, so that all of the big cities along China's east coast would develop more rapidly and would develop its industry. In terms of the rural, we see extremely rapid growth in the 1980s, and we see that basically fall off into the 1990s. What this suggests is that we've seen urban development at the expense of rural development. And statistics show now that, in fact, since the 1990s, people living in the countryside in China are declining or decreasing in their use of health resources, and literacy rates have in fact been declining. So we have a Chinese economy growing at near 10% a year, but the hundreds of millions of peasants living in the countryside are in fact becoming more illiterate and accessing fewer healthcare services than they were before. So in the Chinese case, the rich are getting richer, and they're along the cities, along the coast, and the peasants in the countryside are becoming poorer. Now, the Chinese government recognizes it has to do something about this. As I already said, the Chinese government recognizes that a Gini coefficient of 0.47 is alarmingly high. And so what we've seen over the last decade is this notion of the Harmonious Society. The Chinese government has been basically trying to sell this notion of a harmonious society. And it's through this idea of a harmonious society that China is now going to develop a welfare state. It's going to develop the means, the institutions by which wealth will be redistributed, so that we don't see this type of levels of runaway inequality. But saying you're going to build a welfare state is one thing. Actually putting into place the institutions to create greater levels of egalitarianism, or at least minimizing inequality, is another. There are lots of challenges on the horizon. First is corruption. It is believed that for every dollar sent from the central government down to the local level, about 20 cents actually makes it. That means 80 cents on each dollar is being leaked out at every level of government through corruption. So in other words, the central government may be spending trillions of US dollars, but only a fraction of that actually reaches down to the local level, actually reaches the people that require these resources. Indeed, this is a reflection of China's weak fiscal capacity. It is a huge country. It is governed in a very complicated way in which you have many levels of government. And we see that here in Canada too. When the feds disperse money from Ottawa, then it goes to the provinces, and the provinces disperse it down to cities. There are inefficiencies in this transfer. Well, you can imagine the inefficiencies in China's system, in which you not only have weak institutions, but you also have the corruption I've just described. 65 million workers in just one Chinese province are considered migrant. 65 million workers in China, in one province, is considered migrant, which equals, for that particular province, 70% of all workers. Now, what is a migrant worker? A migrant worker is somebody who doesn't have a permanent job. A migrant worker is somebody who will go into the city. They may live in the countryside, but they'll go into the city and they'll try to find a one-week contract. They might have to go every day to the construction site and hope that they get chosen to work that day. They don't live at home. They oftentimes are homeless, or they're living in very temporary type shelters, or they're living in very cheap, informal, illegal, slum dwelling type homes. In China, in one province, in Guangdong province, one of the richest provinces in China, 70% of workers are informal and migrant. What that means then is that they are invisible to the welfare state. They don't have an address. They don't have a social security number. They don't even have an employer who will claim to employ them. They don't file taxes. They don't have ID. They're not even at their registered homes. In other words, you can spend billions of dollars trying to get and create social services to benefit these people, but for 70% of them, they are invisible. This is a major challenge to the welfare state. You can say we want to get unemployment subsidies to those who are unemployed, but if they have no address, you're not getting it to them. We want to increase healthcare services to those workers who are very poor, who otherwise couldn't afford it, but you don't know where they live. You want to make sure their kids go to school, but their kids aren't registered. That's one of the major challenges of informal work, migrant labor, and the welfare state. And the last challenge is what I call gray income. And by gray income, what I mean are those incomes that you receive in your household that is invisible. Oftentimes through corruption, oftentimes through bribes, maybe a little side payment here, a little side payment there. But either way, it's invisible. And this, in fact, is one of the greatest sources of inequality in China. There was a study, you don't need to know the details about this, but just to give you a sense, there was a study in which these researchers went around to households and said, how much do you report your income to be? Oh, I make $1,000 a month. Okay. How much do you spend each month? On your house, on your clothes, on your schooling, on your cars, on your investment portfolios, and so on. And when you actually stack the two up, how much you say you make and how much you spend, that difference is what we call gray income. So you may say to the government, and you may report, I make $1,000 a month, but somehow I have 3 houses and 3 Mercedes-Benzes, and my kids go to Harvard. I make $1,000 a month, but I spend $20,000. That gap, that gray income, which has now been systematically sussed out, is equal to 30% of China's GNP, or equal to 1.5 trillion US dollars per year. That is unreported, that is invisible, that is circulating through the economy, but that is basically invisible. 90% of that gray income is accounted for by the top quintile. Just so you don't think that, well, it's the poor peasants who are hiding those few dollars in their mattresses set, in terms of illegal income. 90% of that $1.5 trillion is held by the top 20% of income earners in China. Which is, again, as you can imagine, a great source of inequality. Just to give you another sense, 60% of that gray income is in fact in the top decile. 60% of that $1.5 trillion is held by the top 10% of those in China. So again, before you say, oh, well, it's the poor peasants who are able to afford and hide a little bit of extra so that their lives are a little bit better. No, in fact, it is the top 10% which account for 60% of $1.5 trillion. This is what we call inequality in wealth. Inequality in income is what you report to the government. This is inequality in wealth. If you recall, in 2009, in reported income, the top 10% earns 23 times more than the bottom 10%. This is in reported income. This is in official income. If you include gray income or wealth based on what you spend, the difference goes from 23 times between the top 10% and bottom 10% to 65 times. The Gini coefficient is estimated then to go from 0.47, which is already ranked among the most unequal in the world, to 0.65, which would make China the single most unequal society in the world. The point I want to make here, and one of the challenges, therefore, in this story of domestic inequality is being able to see it. It is the distinction between wealth and income. The welfare state, as I've described it, the Swedish welfare state, the Canadian welfare state, the welfare state of the 20th century that we so are invested in and love and think is so great, redistributes income. It's very, very ineffective at redistributing wealth. And looking at this data, it would seem to me, and I would think that you would agree, that the challenge is not just redistributing income, but increasingly it's a challenge of redistributing wealth. And it's this point that I want to make. The welfare state, the great Swedish welfare state, the great industrial guilds of Germany, the Labour Party in the UK, the NDP in Canada, the unions in Canada, and so on. The welfare state of the advanced industrial countries was always based on work. You had to work to get benefits from the welfare state. You had to be formally employed. You had to have a job. You had to have an address. You had to file taxes. Your employer had to file taxes. You had to basically exist in the labor market for the welfare state to work. But for 70% of those living in that Chinese province, they don't technically work, and therefore they are invisible to the welfare state. Which then leads me to the third story. Obviously, one of the hallmarks of modern society, and indeed ours here in Canada and all of the other modern advanced industrial countries of the world, is the the changing status of women. More progressive attitudes, more legislation, and so on. In one sense, we have more of a normative commitment to equality. That there are some societies in which there needs to be very little government intervention. Just simply legal structures allows for the normative commitment to greater gender equality to come to the fore. We've seen over the last 2 decades, for instance, greater equality in terms of education. In fact, in most advanced industrial countries now, women have higher attainment levels in education than men. We have seen over the last few decades greater participation rates among women in formal labor markets. Now this is important. In the past, women have always worked, but they tended to, at least statistically, work in part-time jobs, short-term contracts, and so on. Now, in terms of formal labor market sector participation, women are almost on par with men. That they are working in these now long-term permanent positions in the formal labor market. We've also seen, as a reflection of this normative commitment to equality, changing family dynamics. Within the private sphere, we see the changing gender division of labor within a household, such that now we don't speak of maternity leave, which we used to in Canada, but we speak of parental leave. Because both fathers and mothers are now exiting from the labor market and taking on larger roles within the household, more than ever before. So in many ways, we can say that in terms of gender and social protection, we have come a long way as modern societies, and indeed, we have. But feminist critiques of the welfare state point out, however, that to the extent that these protections are put in place, a normative commitment to equality, gender equality in education, participation in formal labor markets, and so on, legislation against domestic violence, and so on, that all of these institutions are a function of a welfare state that is still wed to work.